The transport ships circled the planet like metal vultures in the purple sky. Marcus Reed pressed his face against the cold window and watched the endless green forest below. His stomach twisted with nerves as he counted the other candidates. Around him, 64 beings from different worlds sat in the cargo hold, each one preparing for the worst week of their lives. The Galactic Academy had created this test 50 years ago after too many graduates died on their first deep space missions. They called it the survival examination, but everyone knew its real name was the death trial. Only the strongest and smartest would pass. The rest would either quit by pressing their emergency beacon or die trying to prove themselves. Marcus looked at his competition and felt his confidence drain away. The Vorthek delegates sat in the corner, their thick reptilian skin gleaming under the ship lights. Each one stood 8 feet tall with muscles that could crush steel. They came from desert, planets where the sun never set and water was more precious than gold. Next to them, the Luminae floated in their containment fields, their translucent bodies glowing with inner light. These beings had evolved in the gas clouds of giant planets, feeding on energy itself. The Chithari clicked and buzzed to each other. In their complex language, their insect-like bodies covered in natural armor that could stop bullets. Then there was Marcus, a human from Earth, barely 6 feet tall with soft pink skin and no natural weapons. He had trained for 2 years to get into this program, but looking at the other species made him feel like a child playing with giants. The ship captain announced their arrival over the intercom. His voice crackled through the speakers as he explained the rules one final time. Each candidate would be dropped at a random location with basic survival gear and 1 emergency beacon. They had 7 days to survive on planet Karth 7 without outside help. The planet had 2 suns that created scorching days and freezing nights. The native wildlife was hostile, and the weather could change from calm to deadly in minutes. Marcus checked his gear bag one more time. He had a survival knife, 50 feet of rope, a small medical kit, water purification tablets, and a fire starter. The bag also contained 3 days' worth of emergency rations, but the rules said using them would result in point deductions. Real. Survivors found their own food. The drop doors opened with a loud hiss, and cold air rushed into the cargo hold. One by one, the candidates stepped forward and received their deployment coordinates. Marcus watched as the massive Vorthek jumped from the ship without hesitation, their heavy bodies crashing through the forest canopy like falling boulders. The Luminae drifted down on energy currents, their forms barely visible against the purple sky. The Chithari used their natural gliding abilities to reach the ground in perfect formation. When Marcus stepped up to the drop door, the wind hit him like a physical blow. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, a sea of green broken only by silver rivers and dark cliffs. The air smelled of strange flowers and something else he could not identify. Something dangerous. He jumped. The fall lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. His parachute deployed automatically, and he drifted down through the thick canopy. Branches scraped against his face and tore at his clothes. He crashed through the final layer of leaves and hit the ground hard, rolling. To absorb the impact like his training had taught him, Marcus lay still for a moment, listening to the sounds of the forest. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the calls of other candidates as they began their survival routines. A Vorthek was already digging, its claws scraping against stone. The Chithari were clicking instructions to each other as they searched. For building materials, he stood up and looked around his landing zone. Massive trees surrounded him, their trunks so wide that 10 people holding hands could not wrap their arms around them. The bark was dark gray and looked as hard as metal. The locals called them ironwood trees, and Marcus could see why. These giants had survived countless storms and fires, their tops disappearing into the green canopy far above. The first sun was already beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Marcus knew from his research that the temperature would drop quickly once both suns disappeared. Most candidates would focus on finding shelter at ground level, just like their species had done for thousands of years, but Marcus had a different plan. He looked up at the towering trees and smiled. Humans were the only species in the examination that had evolved as climbers. His ancestors had lived in trees long before they learned to walk upright. While other species had adapted to specific environments, humans had learned to adapt any environment to suit their needs. Marcus pulled out his rope and began looking for the right spot to start climbing. He had studied the other species carefully during the flight, and he knew their weaknesses. The Vorthak were too heavy to climb effectively. The Luminae could float but needed energy sources to maintain their forms. The Chithuri were excellent builders but only worked close to the ground. None of them would think to look up. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Marcus began his ascent. The ironwood bark was rough and provided good handholds, but the climb was exhausting. His muscles burned as he pulled himself higher, one grip at a time. Below him, he could hear the sounds of other candidates struggling with the approaching cold. By the time he reached the first major branch, 30 feet above the ground, the temperature had dropped 20 degrees. Marcus tied off his rope and rested for a moment, looking down at the forest floor. In the distance, he could see the glow of fires as other candidates tried to stay warm. He had found his battlefield. Now he just had to survive long enough to win it. The night was young, and the real test was just beginning. The first night on Korath 7 tested everyone's resolve. Marcus shivered on his tree branch as the temperature dropped below freezing. His breath formed clouds in the cold air, and ice crystals began forming on the leaves around him. But he was still warmer than the candidates on the ground. Through the darkness, he could hear the sounds of suffering. Several Vorthak were clicking their distress calls, their desert-adapted bodies struggling with the cold. The Luminae glowed dimly as they tried to conserve energy, their forms flickering like dying candles. At least 3 emergency beacons had already been activated during the night, their bright flares lighting up the forest as failed candidates called for rescue. Marcus had managed to sleep in short bursts, wedged securely between 2 thick branches. It was uncomfortable, but it was better than the frozen ground below. When the first sun rose, painting the forest in golden light, he began his real work. He had chosen his location carefully during the night. 4 massive ironwood trees grew close together, their branches intertwining about 40 feet above the ground. The trees formed a natural square that would provide perfect anchor points for his plan. While other candidates searched for caves or dug burrows, Marcus began building. Upward. Using his survival knife, he cut down smaller branches and began lashing them together with his rope. The work was slow and careful. One mistake could send him plummeting to his death, but Marcus had trained for this. Human ancestors had built shelters in trees for millions of years. The knowledge was buried deep in his genetic memory. Below him, the other candidates were following their species' traditional survival methods. The Vorthak had successfully dug several burrows, using their powerful claws to scrape through the hard earth. These tunnels would protect them from the cold, but Marcus could see the problems they would face. The forest floor was already damp from morning dew, and dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. The Luminae had found some success near a grove of energy crystals that grew naturally in the area. These crystalline formations could sustain their energy-based biology, but the crystals were small and widely scattered. The Luminae had to move constantly to find new power sources, making it impossible to build permanent shelters. The Chithuri had impressed Marcus with their organization. They worked as a collective, each member contributing to their group's survival. They had built several small shelters from mud and fallen branches, creating a temporary colony near a freshwater stream, but their constructions were low and vulnerable to flooding. Marcus continued working on his platform, cutting and tying branches with practiced efficiency. By midday, he had created a solid foundation between the 4 trees. The platform was 8 feet square and strong enough to support his weight. More importantly, it was 40 feet above the ground, well out of reach of most ground-based predators. The afternoon brought new challenges. A group of native predators emerged from the underbrush, drawn by the scent of the off-world visitors. The creatures looked like a cross between wolves and lizards, with scales that shifted color to match their surroundings. They moved in coordinated packs, their intelligence clearly higher than normal animals. The ground-based candidates immediately went into defensive modes. The Vorthak used their size and strength to drive off the predators, but not without injury. Marcus could see blood on several of their arms and legs. The Chitheri formed defensive circles, their natural armor protecting them from most attacks. But the predators were persistent, and the insects were being worn down. The Luminae had the worst of it. Their energy-based forms provided no physical defense against the creatures. 3 of them were forced to activate their emergency beacons when the predators proved too aggressive. Their glowing forms disappeared in flashes of transport light. As rescue ships collected them, from his high perch, Marcus watched the battles below with growing understanding. The examination was not just about surviving the environment. It was about understanding how to use that environment to your advantage. The other species were fighting against the planet, trying to impose their evolutionary advantages on an alien world. Marcus was doing something different. He was working with the planet, using its resources to create solutions that did not exist in nature. The ironwood trees were his allies, not obstacles. The height was his protection, not a barrier. To overcome Dom as the day wore on, Marcus expanded his platform into a more complex structure. He built walls on 3 sides, leaving the 4th open for access. He created a sloped roof using overlapping branches and large leaves, designed to shed water and provide insulation. Most importantly, he began work on a fireplace, fire at ground. Level was dangerous and attracted predators. Fire 40 feet up was different. Marcus carefully arranged stones in a circle and built a chimney system using hollow branches. The smoke would rise through the canopy, dispersing naturally and avoiding detection. The fire would provide warmth and cooking capability, while remaining hidden from ground-based threats. The other candidates noticed his construction but could not understand its purpose. To them, it looked like the human was wasting time and energy on unnecessary complications. The Vorthak focused on deepening their burrows. The Chitheri worked on strengthening their ground defenses. The Luminae continued their desperate search for energy sources. None of them looked up by evening. Marcus had a functional treehouse. It was simple but effective, with walls, a roof, and a working fireplace. He had also begun work on a water collection system, using large leaves and hollow branches to channel rainwater into his storage containers. As the second night fell and temperatures dropped again, Marcus sat by his small fire and looked out over the forest. Below him, the other candidates huddled in their shelters, fighting the cold and watching for predators. Emergency beacons flashed in the distance as more candidates gave up. Marcus pulled out his emergency rations and allowed himself a small meal. He had found several edible plants during his construction work, but he wanted to save his energy for the bigger challenges ahead. The weather monitoring equipment in his gear bag showed a major storm approaching. Rain, wind, and possibly hail would test every shelter in the forest. He looked up at the sturdy branches above him and smiled. Let the storm come. He would be ready. The storm warnings came at dawn on the 3rd day. Marcus woke to the sound of emergency broadcasts crackling through his gear bag radio. The weather monitoring stations were tracking a massive storm system moving across the continent. Wind speeds would reach dangerous levels and the rainfall would be heavy enough to cause flash flooding. Marcus looked down at the forest floor and saw immediate panic among the other candidates. The Vorthak were frantically trying to seal their burrows, but the entrances were already showing signs of water seepage from the morning dew. The Chitheri were reinforcing their structures, but their low-built shelters would be the first to flood when the water rose. The Luminae faced the worst situation of all. Their energy crystals would be scattered by high winds, and their ethereal forms could not survive in the heavy rain. Several of them were already gathering near the emergency beacon activation zone, preparing to quit the examination before the storm hit. Marcus checked his treehouse construction and found it solid but incomplete. He had built the basic shelter, but a storm of this magnitude would require additional preparations. He needed to waterproof his walls, secure his roof, and most importantly, create a drainage system that would keep water from pooling on his platform. Working quickly, Marcus began applying a technique he had learned from studying human survival methods. The ironwood bark contained natural resins that became waterproof when heated. Using his fire, he began melting the resin and applying it to the joints between his wall branches. The process was slow and required careful temperature control, but it created a seal that would keep the rain out. While Marcus worked on waterproofing, the other candidates struggled with their own preparations. The Vorthak were trying to dig drainage channels around their burrows, but the hard ground made progress slow. Their claws, perfect for desert sand, scraped ineffectively against the rocky soil. Water was already beginning to pool in their tunnels. The Shithari showed their collective intelligence by working together on flood preparations. They built small dams and channels to divert water away from their colony. But their structures were made from mud and organic materials that would not survive heavy rainfall. Marcus could see the stress in their movements as they worked frantically to strengthen their defenses. By midday, the first winds began to pick up. The massive ironwood trees swayed gently, their deep roots keeping them stable despite the growing gusts. Marcus felt his platform move slightly but remained confident in his anchor points. He had chosen these trees specifically because they were storm survivors. Their massive trunks scarred by decades of severe weather, the rain began as a light drizzle that quickly became a steady downpour. Marcus watched water cascade off his sloped roof and flow away from his platform through the drainage channels he had carved. His waterproofing held perfectly, keeping the interior of his treehouse dry and comfortable. Below him, the situation was becoming desperate. The Vorthak burrows were flooding despite their best efforts. The desert reptiles had no experience with water management, and their underground shelters were becoming death traps. Marcus counted at least 5 emergency beacons activated by Vorthak, who chose rescue over drowning. The Shithari colony was fighting a losing battle against the rising water. Their carefully constructed shelters were dissolving in the rain, and their defensive positions were being washed away. The insects tried to move to higher ground, but their heavy armor made climbing difficult. They were trapped between the flooding forest floor and their inability to reach safety. The Luminae had already given up. The storm scattered their energy crystals and made flight impossible. Their glowing forms flickered weakly as they activated their emergency beacons. Marcus watched as transport ships collected them through the rain. Their chances of completing the examination over. As the storm intensified, Marcus realized his treehouse was providing more than just shelter. His elevated position gave him a clear view of the entire testing area, allowing him to observe and learn from the mistakes of other candidates. He could see which areas flooded first, where the wind was strongest, and how the native wildlife responded to the storm. The rain continued for hours, turning the forest floor into a series of connected streams and pools. Marcus measured the water level and calculated that ground-based shelters would need to be at least 6 feet above the normal forest floor to avoid flooding. None of the other candidates had built with this consideration in mind. During the worst of the storm, Marcus made an important discovery about the ironwood trees. Their bark was not just waterproof when heated, it was also an excellent insulator. The resin he had applied to his walls was keeping his treehouse warm despite the cold rain. He was comfortable in his shelter while other candidates suffered from hypothermia. The wind reached its peak intensity during the afternoon, howling through the forest with enough force to uproot smaller trees. Marcus felt his platform shake as the ironwood trees bent and twisted in the gusts. But his construction held firm, the flexible joints he had created allowing the structure to move with the trees rather than fighting against them. From his vantage point, Marcus could see the devastating effect of the storm on the other candidates. The few remaining Vorthak had abandoned their flooded burrows and were huddled in the open, their scales providing little protection from the driving rain. The Chithari had lost their colony entirely, their organized groups scattered as individual. Insects sought whatever shelter they could find. As evening approached, the storm began to weaken. The rain reduced to a steady shower, and the wind died down to manageable levels. Marcus looked out over the transformed forest and saw a landscape that had been completely reshaped by the weather. New streams carved through the terrain, and Fallen trees created barriers and bridges that had not existed before. The examination monitors would later describe the storm as a perfect test of adaptive engineering. It had eliminated candidates who relied on traditional methods and favored those who could innovate under pressure. Marcus had not just survived the storm, he had used it as an opportunity to improve his shelter and gather intelligence about the testing environment. As darkness fell, Marcus sat by his fire and listened to the forest slowly returning to normal. The sounds of distress calls and emergency beacons had mostly stopped. The candidates who remained were the ones who had found ways to work with the planet rather than against it. Marcus was no longer just surviving the examination. He was beginning to understand it. The test was not about being the strongest or the most naturally adapted. It was about being the most clever, the most flexible, and the most willing to learn from the environment itself. The storm had been his teacher, and he had passed the first real lesson. The fourth day dawned clear and bright, revealing the true devastation of the storm. Marcus looked out from his treehouse and saw a transformed landscape. The forest floor was still covered in standing water, creating a series of temporary lakes and streams. Fallen branches and debris created obstacles that made ground travel dangerous and difficult. Of the 64 candidates who had started the examination, less than 20 remained. The storm had eliminated the weakest and least adaptable, leaving only those who had found effective ways to survive the harsh conditions. Marcus counted the remaining candidates from his elevated position, noting their locations and conditions. The surviving Vorthak had learned from their mistakes. They had abandoned their flooded burrows and were attempting to build elevated platforms using fallen logs and stones. But their heavy bodies and limited construction experience made progress slow. Their platforms were crude and unstable, barely 3 feet above the water level. The remaining Chithari had scattered after losing their colony. They were now working as individuals rather than as a collective, each insect trying to find high ground or create personal shelters. Their natural armor protected them from the elements, but they struggled without their traditional group coordination. Most surprising were the two Luminae who had not activated their emergency beacons. These energy beings had found a way to survive by anchoring themselves to the large crystal formations that dotted the forest. They remained motionless, conserving energy and waiting for better conditions. Marcus spent the morning expanding his treehouse into a more complex structure. He had learned valuable lessons from the storm and was now building with long-term survival in mind. Using techniques his ancestors had developed over thousands of years, he created a multi-level platform system that made efficient use of the space between the trees. The main living platform remained at 40 feet, but Marcus added a second level 10 feet higher for observation and food storage. He built a third level at ground level, connected to the main structure by a rope and pulley system. This ground platform would serve as a base for collecting water and materials while keeping his main shelter secure. The rope and pulley system was a masterpiece of human engineering. Marcus had created a mechanical advantage that allowed him to lift heavy objects to his treehouse with minimal effort. The other candidates watched in confusion as he hauled large stones and thick branches 40 feet into the air using only his body weight and simple physics. Food became a critical issue on the fourth day. The storm had disrupted the normal patterns of the forest, and the traditional food sources were either destroyed or relocated. The surviving candidates were forced to expand their search areas and try new hunting methods. Marcus had a significant advantage in this area. His elevated position allowed him to observe the forest from a unique perspective. He could see the movement patterns of the tree-dwelling creatures that other candidates could not reach. Using simple snares and traps, he began catching the small mammals and birds that lived in the canopy. The canopy ecosystem was rich and diverse, completely separate from the ground-level environment where other candidates were competing for resources. Marcus found fruits, nuts, and edible plants that grew only in the treetops. He discovered that many of these foods were more nutritious than the ground-level alternatives, providing better energy for the demanding survival conditions. Water collection became another area where Marcus's design proved superior. His multi-level platform system included gutters and collection points that channeled rainwater into storage containers. The elevated position meant his water was cleaner and less contaminated than the ground-level sources other candidates were using during the afternoon. Marcus made an important discovery about the thermal properties of his elevated position. The forest canopy created distinct temperature zones, with the most comfortable conditions existing between 30 and 50 feet above ground. At this height, the air temperature remained relatively stable throughout the day, avoiding both the scorching heat at ground level and the cold of the upper atmosphere. This thermal advantage explained why Marcus was using less energy to maintain his body temperature than the other candidates. The Vorthak were struggling with the temperature swings between day and night, their desert-adapted bodies unable to regulate efficiently in the fluctuating conditions. The Chitheri were burning precious calories to maintain their internal temperature, weakening their overall survival capabilities. The remaining candidates began to take notice of Marcus's success. Several Vorthak attempted to climb the ironwood trees, but their heavy bodies and clawed feet could not grip the smooth bark effectively. They managed to reach heights of 10 or 15 feet before exhaustion forced them to give up. The Chitheri had better climbing abilities, but their individualistic approach meant they could not coordinate the complex construction techniques needed to build at height. They created small personal shelters in the lower branches, but these were vulnerable to predators and weather. The Luminae attempted to float up to Marcus's level, but their weakened state made sustained flight impossible. They could reach the canopy for brief periods, but they could not remain there long enough to establish permanent positions. Marcus realized that his success was not just about human adaptability. It was about understanding the three-dimensional nature of the environment. While other species thought in terms of ground-level territory and resources, humans had evolved to think vertically. His ancestors had used trees not just as shelter but as highways, hunting grounds, and observation posts. As the fourth day ended, Marcus had established a secure base of operations that other candidates could not match. His treehouse provided safety, comfort, and access to resources that were unavailable at ground level. More importantly, it gave him a strategic advantage that would become crucial in the final days of the examination. The examination proctors, monitoring the test from orbit, were taking special interest in the humans' approach. Their records showed no previous candidate who had attempted such extensive vertical construction. Marcus was not just surviving the examination, he was redefining what survival meant in a forest environment. As night fell, Marcus sat by his fire and looked out over the forest. The other candidates were still struggling with basic survival needs while he was planning improvements and expansions to his aerial base. He had food, water, shelter, and security. Most importantly, he had proven that humans could not only adapt to alien environments but could transform them into spaces where humans could thrive. The examination was far from over, but Marcus was no longer just another candidate. He had become something the other species had never seen before, a human who had found a way to make an alien world feel like home. The final 3 days of the examination brought challenges that tested not just survival skills but the ability to thrive in an alien environment. Marcus woke on the 5th day to find his treehouse surrounded by a thick fog that had rolled in during the night. The mist was so dense that he could barely see the ground below, but his elevated position meant he was above the worst of it. From his observation platform, Marcus watched the fog create chaos for the remaining ground-based candidates. The limited visibility made navigation impossible, and the moisture in the air brought new dangers. Several species of native creatures that had been hiding during the clear weather now emerged to hunt in the fog. Their calls echoed through the forest, creating an atmosphere of constant threat. The surviving Vorthak were trapped in their makeshift shelters, unable to see potential threats until they were dangerously close. Marcus watched through gaps in the fog as one of the large reptiles fought off a pack of the shape-shifting predators. The Vorthak's strength and armor saved it from serious injury, but the encounter used precious energy reserves that could not be easily replaced. The scattered Chitheri faced even greater difficulties. Their individual shelters provided little protection from the fog hunters, and their lack of coordination made them easy targets. Marcus saw emergency beacons flashing through the mist as two more insects decided that survival was more important. Then, completing the examination, the Luminae had found some success by using their natural glow to navigate through the fog, but their light also attracted unwanted attention. The energy beings were forced to dim their luminescence and remain motionless. Conserving power and avoiding detection, Marcus used the fog as an opportunity to expand his treehouse complex. Working quietly in the mist, he built additional platforms and storage areas. The reduced visibility meant other candidates could not observe his construction techniques, giving him a strategic advantage. He created a smokehouse for preserving meat, a workshop for making tools, and a greenhouse area for growing plants he had discovered in the canopy. The fog lasted through the 6th day, testing the patience and resources of every remaining candidate. Marcus had prepared for this possibility by stockpiling food and water. His elevated position meant he could collect moisture from the fog itself, using cloth collectors to gather drinking water from the air. When the fog finally cleared on the morning of the 7th day, it revealed a forest that had been transformed once again. The moisture had encouraged rapid plant growth, changing the distribution of food sources. New flowers bloomed in the canopy, attracting different species of insects and birds that Marcus could harvest. The examination proctors arrived at midday for the final evaluation. Representatives from each species came to assess the surviving candidates and determine who had not just survived but excelled under the extreme conditions. The proctors traveled in hovering observation platforms, visiting each candidate's shelter and interviewing them about their experiences. Marcus was the last candidate to be evaluated. The proctor's platform rose slowly through the forest canopy, their occupants staring in amazement at the complex structure that had grown around the ironwood trees. What had started as a simple platform had become a three-dimensional city in the trees, with multiple levels connected by bridges and zip lines. The lead proctor, a tall being with silver skin and large eyes, spoke first. "Candidate Marcus Reed, please explain your construction methodology and resource management strategies." Marcus gestured to his treehouse complex with pride. "I analyzed the environment from a three-dimensional perspective rather than limiting myself to ground level. Resources. The canopy ecosystem provided food, water, materials, and thermal regulation that were unavailable at surface level. By building upward, I created a sustainable living space that could support long-term habitation." The Vorthok proctor, whose species had lost more than half their candidates, asked the obvious question. "How did you achieve the height necessary for this construction?" "Our candidates found the trees impossible to climb." Marcus smiled and demonstrated his rope and pulley system. "Human ancestors evolved as climbers and tool users. We developed techniques for working at height that other species never needed." The key was understanding that the trees were not obstacles to overcome but resources to utilize. The Chithori proctor buzzed with interest. "Your individual construction methods are impressive, but how would they scale for group survival scenarios?" Marcus had anticipated this question. The modular design allows for easy expansion. Additional platforms can be added to accommodate more inhabitants. The rope and pulley system can lift heavy loads that would be impossible for individuals to carry. A group of humans could build a city in these trees using the same basic techniques. The Luminae proctor, whose species had suffered complete elimination, floated closer to examine the fire management system. "How did you solve the combustion?" "Challenges at elevation. Fire at height should be impossible to control safely." Marcus explained his chimney design and smoke dispersal methods. The key was working with the natural air currents rather than fighting them. The smoke rises naturally through the canopy, dispersing before it can be detected from ground level. The fire provides warmth and cooking capability while remaining completely hidden from surface threats. The evaluation continued for 2 hours as the proctors examined every aspect of Marcus's survival strategy. They tested his water collection systems, analyzed his food preservation techniques, and evaluated the structural integrity of his construction. Most importantly, they assessed his understanding of the environment and his ability to work with, rather than against, the natural systems. When the evaluation ended, the proctors conferred among themselves in their various languages. Marcus could not understand their discussions, but he could see the amazement in their expressions. They had never encountered a candidate who had not just survived, but had created a thriving habitat in such a hostile environment. The lead proctor returned to Marcus with the final results. Candidate Marcus Reed, you have achieved the highest score in the history of the survival examination. Your innovative approach to environmental adaptation and resource utilization has exceeded all previous records. More importantly, you have demonstrated capabilities that will be invaluable in deep space exploration and colonization missions. As the proctors departed, Marcus looked out over the forest one final time. Of the 64 candidates who had started the examination, only 12 had completed it successfully. The others had either quit or been eliminated by the harsh conditions. But Marcus had done more than just complete the test. He had shown that humans could thrive in environments that other species found barely survivable. The treehouse stood as a testament to human ingenuity and adaptability. It represented thousands of years of evolutionary development that had given humans the ability to modify their environment rather than simply adapting to it. While other species had evolved to fill specific ecological niches, humans had evolved to create new niches wherever they found themselves. The examination was over, but Marcus's real education was just beginning. He had proven that humans belonged among the stars, not because they were the strongest or the fastest, but because they were the most adaptable. They were the species that could look at any environment and see not just challenges but opportunities. They were the builders, the innovators, the species that could make any world into a home. As the transport ships arrived to collect the successful candidates, Marcus took one last look at his treehouse. Tomorrow he would return to the academy to begin advanced training for deep space missions. But he would never forget the lessons he had learned in the forest canopy, 40 feet above the ground, where he had discovered what it truly meant to be human among the stars.